Okay, so this is part 2 of 2 for chapter 11, stratification by gender. We're going to start by talking about the status of women worldwide. Most people can probably agree that there's been dramatic improvement over the past 25 years. Some parts of the world, the gender gap is slim or it's continuing to narrow. So think countries like here in the United States, Western Europe, Scandinavian countries, Canada, etc. And then other parts of the world, there's certainly still room for progress. An interesting statistic noted in the text is that women in the world grow half of the world's food, but they rarely own the land. They also make up a third of the world's workforce, but they're generally found in the world's lowest paying jobs. So that both of those statistics attribute to the fact that women still do suffer from second-class status worldwide. In looking at the issue from a conflict perspective, they would argue that industrialized nations like the United States and Western Europe, along with their corporations, still continue to exploit workers in developing nations. So for example, you have textile workers working in poor countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Bangladesh, the Dominican Republic, etc., working in conditions that would be deemed illegal in the United States. So they're working for low pay, and they're working in unsafe and unsanitary environments that are considered to be very dangerous. This contributes to the poor quality of life that many suffer from and even fatal consequences. So if you take a look at this image right here, this is a factory from Bangladesh that collapsed. This just happened last year, April 2013, and this was all attributed to the poor working conditions of the factory. The owners of the factory were aware of these conditions, yet they did nothing to improve them until the building collapsed. And this led to 1,129 deaths, many of which were women. There are definitely charitable organizations that work on behalf of these exploited workers and women. They help to provide restitution for the victims and their families, but these working conditions still continue to exist. On the other hand, many women have responded by fighting for equal treatment, even in places like Pakistan. So many have heard of the story of Malala Yousafzai, who was shot in the head by the Taliban for speaking out so that women could be allowed to get an education in Pakistan. She's from one of the poorest and most dangerous countries in the world, yet she has now become this recognizable face worldwide because she survived this gunshot wound without permanent damage, and she still continues to fight and speak out on behalf of women in Pakistan. Okay, we're going to move on and talk about women in the United States and labor force participation. So the 20th century saw a lot of movement for women and a lot of progress, starting with the passing of the 19th Amendment, which was in 1920. Then they flooded the workforce during World War II when men left to join the service. And now we have 59% of adult women in the labor force versus 41% in 1970. There still are some industries that are mainly filled by women, including nursing and elementary school teachers. And then there are other industries that are mainly represented by men. 90% of civil engineers are men, 69% of computer analysts are men, and 68% of physicians are still men. Sometimes it's a bias of the industry or the organization that prevents them from reaching their full potential, and earlier we defined that as the glass ceiling, so an invisible barrier that blocks promotion of a qualified individual because of their gender, race, or ethnicity. Okay, the last point I want to make on this slide is about compensation. There is still disparity in pay between men and women, which is not explained by their career choices because this disparity still occurs even when men and women are in the same exact career. And on this next slide, you'll see that illuminated. So these two tables on slide 11 were compiled by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics in 2012 and then found on the website called catalyst.org. Right here you can see the website information, the source information. So there's definitely much more interesting information than these two tables I have on this slide, and I encourage you to visit the website. So first, this table on top shows that education is a factor in income. Statistics show that higher degrees lead to higher median salaries, and I think most of us were aware of that. Men do still earn more than women in each category, and that percentage is shows that on average, regardless of what the degree is, so from doctoral all the way down to high school graduate, women are averaging somewhere between 75 to 79% of what men are weekly. The bottom table shows that there's an earnings difference between men and women, and that varies with age. And I think this is a pretty positive statistic to look at. So you can see that with the age group, you have the earnings percentage narrowing. So while those in the older working group, ages 55 to 64, 45 to 54, women are making 70%, 76% of what men are making. But if you look at these younger groups, 20 to 24 years old, 25 to 34 years old, you'll find that the wage gap has narrowed significantly. And this is for full-time workers. So with that, we can basically conclude that it's certainly getting better and that gap is certainly narrowing here in the United States. Okay, so in continuing our conversation about women in the workforce in the United States, we're going to look at some of the social consequences of women working. So we do know that more women have entered the workforce. 59% of women in the U.S. are part of that workforce. However, they still are juggling responsibilities at home. Statistically, women still share a larger portion of housework. A study cited in your book by sociologist Arlie Hochschild followed 52 couples over the course of 8 years, and some of her conclusions were that women spend 15 fewer hours each week on leisure than her husband. In a year, these women worked an extra month of 24-hour days because of what's known as the second shift. And that second shift is defined as work outside the home, followed by childcare and then housework. Over 12 years, that comes to a whole year's worth of days. Another study, a Harvard study, found that 40% of women left work voluntarily for months or years to take care of their children, while only 24% of men did. So overall, the conclusion is that there are greater amounts of time that women put into caring for the children and housework, and that takes a toll on their careers. The next chart is from your text, and it shows the division of household work comparing other countries, other modern countries, to the United States. So on this left column, if the number is higher, that means that the women always does the housework. And if it's lower, that means that the husband always does. So since most of these are above 3, it shows that in all modern countries, Canada, United States, Norway, etc., women do take a larger portion of the household work. On this right column, this shows empowerment. So the higher the number, the more equal women are to men. So we've heard of the saying, who wears the pants? This would be an equivalent statistic to that. So what's interesting is in Norway and in other Scandinavian countries, there's much more equality between men and women, both inside the home and outside the home. So you see that is 1, which means that they're the most equal. And then you'll see in countries like Japan, that number is very low. And the United States is quite up there. Okay, so the last thing that I have for you today is an interesting test created by Harvard. It's called the Implicit Association Test. The test is created to see if you have any biases about women when thinking about science or careers. It takes you about 5 minutes, and I'm going to ask you to access it on this website. You can see the URL at the top of the slide right here. And so you're going to go to the website. When you get to that website, you'll see this arrow pointing to where you can go ahead and take the test as a guest, so that avoids registration, and you can just go ahead and hop in there. You do a quick little consent form, and then you can take the test. When you've finished, I want you to record your results at the bottom of the notes, of your notes that you have. You can choose to do one of the 2 gender tests. So one is called gender career and one is called gender science, or you can do both. And I look forward to seeing your results. Thanks, and I'll see you in class.